It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary.
Well, I hardly need to introduce our next speaker. It's the old cliche about he needs no introduction. I've known Gary since, I think, 1982. I have to say he's probably the most prolific military historian that I know, and I do know a lot of prolific military historians. I'm going to call Gary the Lionel Messi of military history, and in terms of hitting the right target and the number of goals scored, above average, I think. So I always look forward to what Gary's got to say, and let's, as usual, welcome him to the President's Conference as a Vice President.
Thanks, Pete. Though given my football allegiances, I'd settle for Jack Wilshere. Yes. I'm going to be picking up on some of Spencer's themes here in my paper, although I'm actually taking it back up a level, back up to the level of operational, basically the operational level of war, although Douglas Haig does actually have some tactical input on occasions in the 1914 campaign. One of the problems about looking at Haig in 1914 is people tend to read history backwards. Whatever view you might have about him as Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front between the end of 1915 and the end of the war, it's not, in my view, terribly relevant to looking at what he did in 1914, because he's operating at a completely different level. And also, of course, when he goes into the war in 1914, he is pretty well unknown as a commander. He has some command experience, commanding a column, effectively a brigade-sized unit in the Boer War, but his principal reputation actually is a highly competent staff officer and military reformer. He is not someone, to repeat, who has a particular reputation in August 1914 as a commander. What I'm going to do is to spend a little bit of time talking about the pre-war period, the last 5 or 6 years before he takes one corps to war in 1914, because I think that actually does shed quite a bit of light on the way that he, as I think the most thoughtful of the British High Commanders in 1914, tried to prepare himself for war. Now, I think we can discard the idea that Haig is a sort of, in geological terms, an erratic, that is a very rare thinking soldier in an officer corps full of numpties. It's not quite as simple as that, but I think he was unusual, the extent to which he tried to prepare himself mentally for the challenges of war. Then, of course, I'll go on to talk about what then happens on campaign. It's worth making the point that Haig had created a reputation for himself as a very promising officer, the coming man, if you like, from the very earliest days. He, of course, was the top cadet at Sandhurst in 1884, and as early as 1892-93, as still a quite junior officer, he caught the eyes of some very senior people in India because he had a couple of things going for him. He had a sharp, if not outstanding, mind. He had a huge capacity for hard work. He was very willing to learn, and he had an excellent grasp of the essentials of soldiering. Sometimes it's said of Haig, he's basically a duffer who gets on because he has patrons in high places. He does have patrons in high places, but for very good reason. He is seen as being very good. And so, he reaches the top because he has proved himself. It's worth pointing out, of course, that we can exaggerate the extent of his rise, or rather the speed of his rise. He goes to South Africa in 1899 as the Chief Staff Officer to Sir John French of the Cavalry Division, as I think he's just become a major. He's very recently been a captain. At the end of the Boer War, 4 years later, he's a Major General. Now that is because he is one of the group of people who actually win their spurs in South Africa. Bing and Plumer are others. War is a very good way of actually sorting out from the wheat from the chaff. And Haig's career, which is actually very promising, doesn't actually get very far in terms of promotion until he goes and actually does the business as a staff officer and a commander in South Africa. Thereafter, he spends an awful lot of his time doing some frankly quite demanding and not very exciting administrative and staff jobs. If I just read you just some of the key jobs he had between coming back from South Africa and taking one corps to France in 1940, he makes this point. He's a Director of Staff Duties. He's a Director of Military Training, Chief of Staff, India, and he played an absolutely key role as the military lieutenant to Richard Haldane, the Liberal Secretary of State for War, during the Haldane reforms, which basically creates the BEF and the British Army as it is in 1914. Now again, these are hard, demanding jobs. He plays a key role in formulating doctrine for the cavalry. He's a leading proponent of the idea of a hybrid cavalryman, that is, one who can combine the traditional cavalry roles, the arme blanche and the rest of it, with ability to fight effectively on foot. And in the form of Field Service Regulations 1909, he has a key role in formulating doctrine for the entire army. Now, this doctrine, FSR, is avowedly non-prescriptive. It sets out general principles, to quote, not rules, which will serve as guides, enabling subordinate officials to act in accordance with the views of the Commander-in-Chief, without the necessity of referring to him. They've been criticised for setting forward principles of war and then not saying what those principles are. And that's to completely misunderstand what a principle was meant in this period. They were not seen as bullet points, but rather broad precepts, much in the way that Clausewitz used them. And Haig, we're not quite sure to what extent he actually wrote them, but he certainly had a major influence on the writing of them. And anybody who's looked at his diaries will know he refers to them constantly throughout the First World War. And this, I think you could make a very good case. This is one of his major achievements. Long before he actually takes the British Army to war, actually in formulating a doctrine under which that army will fight in contact with the enemy. Now, he takes over Aldershot Command, which in time of war transforms into First Corps in March 1912. Now, Haig is not alone in believing that war with Germany is coming, and there's only a relatively short time to prepare for the army for war, but it's pretty clear when he arrives in Aldershot in 1912, preparations for war take on a new sense of urgency. Major Eugene Ryan, Mickey Ryan, a medical officer who becomes a good personal friend of Haig and actually serves with him for a good deal of the war, later wrote that after Haig succeeded Smith-Dorrien, interestingly, in this post at Aldershot, it was noticed and talked of in the messes that the training of both officers and soldiers became much more strenuous. Regimental exercises, brigade and divisional training with long route marches were the order of the day. The manner of training changed frequently, especially during the hot weather, when men worked without wearing their tunics. And long route marches, the men did wear their tunics, but with open necks unbuttoned. Now, minor point, but actually in the British Army of that period, for a senior officer to say, okay, we're not so worried about what you look like, but actually having an effective form of clothing for combat conditions, that's quite important. If Andy Robertshaw were here, he would tell you about actually how practical British service dress was in 1914, anyway, far more so than its German or French counterparts. Now, in the 1912 manoeuvres, Haig was outgeneraled and defeated by a force commanded by his friend Lieutenant General Sir James Grierson, Jimmy Grierson. Well, the canard that this was caused by Haig's neglect of aerial reconnaissance has in fact been completely debunked. Haig did use cavalry, aircraft and cavalry for scouting, but they both failed to locate the enemy force, Grierson's force. But according to some witnesses, it must be said that Haig did not emerge well from these manoeuvres. The Westminster Gazette's military correspondent wrote this: "With regard to General Haig's strategy, no particular brilliance could be claimed. He worked almost entirely by the training manuals, and his every move could be foreseen and met." However, someone who was not a great Haig fan, to put it mildly, Charles Reppington, he was a Times military correspondent, and he actually didn't like Haig very much, but he gave a rather more balanced critique of the manoeuvres. He offered some qualified praise, but also criticism of Haig and Grierson. Among the things that he said about Haig, he recognised that there was an opportunity for Haig to make a particularly bold but risky attack. But he stated fairly enough, it was a bit of a gamble, and there were not many generals who would take these risks, before slyly adding, and we must give up appointing Scotsmen at the head of our armies if we wish such risks to be run. Well, although the September 1913 army manoeuvres have not gained such notoriety as those of the previous year, they were, if anything, even more contentious than those of 1912. Sir John French acted as both exercise director and commander of Brown Force, consisted of two armies, actually corps, under Haig and General Sir Arthur Paget. The opponent was a skeleton force under Major General Munro. And basically, the criticism was that French was incapable of even defeating a skeleton force when put up against them. Now, Haig's take on the manoeuvres, I think, are very interesting in terms of what was to happen only a year later. He admitted that staff work had been a problem in his corps, saying it was now 50% more effective as a result of the exercise. That's why you have such things. Again, Reppington gave, I think, quite a balanced critique of the exercises. He picked up on a couple of things. One of which is that there was a failure to liaise between Haig and the other force, and also a sizable gap, perhaps as much as 3 miles, developed between the two divisions in the advance to contact. But above all, the real criticism was on Sir John French, who had failed to adequately coordinate the force under his command. So what we've got here is French's failure to coordinate his two corps, the separation of formations, Haig's failure to liaise effectively with the neighbouring corps. In these three aspects, the 1913 army manoeuvres foreshadowed quite eerily what was to happen in France and Belgium a year later. Having said all that, I think it's true to say that Haig's performance in these manoeuvres was not as poor as sometimes has been claimed. Various things emerged from the manoeuvres, which Haig took on board and actually used, I think, to very good effect in the campaign that was to come. And one of the things which has already been mentioned by Spencer is the need to pay attention to fighting retreats, to manoeuvre in retreat. He was very clear what this was all about. In his PXI, in his post-exercise report, he said this. You need to make the best use of ground to delay an advancing force, but resistance must be so calculated that no portion of the force is committed so deeply it risks defeat. The purpose of the delaying action was to force the enemy to deploy and then to hit him with a counterstroke. Added to some other evidence about Haig's thinking at this time, it seems to me that by September 1913, at the absolute latest, I suspect actually sometime before this, Haig had a clearly thought out concept of conducting a fighting retreat, the very thing he was to be doing in August, September 1914. Let's now turn to what happened in the field. Well, Haig's First Corps was, of course, present at the Battle of Mons. They are there. They in fact saw next to no action during the fighting on the 23rd of August. Now, this is one of the most controversial, not to say murky, aspects of Haig's career in 1914, because Second Corps took a fair amount of hammering, did well, was pushed back. First Corps retreated as well. One of the big debates is, could Haig have done more to support Smith-Dorrien? I think the short answer is, yes, he could have done. But he chose not to on this occasion, and indeed 3 days later at the Cateau, for a number of reasons, but the principal one, I think, is that Haig actually had spent a good deal of time before the war studying the potential enemy, studying the German army. He was well aware of the significance of flank manoeuvre in German military history and doctrine. And he was extremely worried that the Germans were seeking to turn the Allied left flank. And this, more than any other single factor, I think helps to explain the way that he behaved and the command decisions he took over the course of the Mons campaign. The fact that at Mons, his First Corps was not attacked actually increased rather than diminished Haig's anxiety. Because if indeed the Germans were seeking to envelop the BEF, they would not attack the inner flank in force. And so what Haig was worrying about was that there was some huge German attempt to get round his flank, perhaps round Fifth Army as well, and would end up with Haig actually being encircled, or BEF being encircled and being destroyed. And I think that helps to explain why he took the decision not to commit major forces to support Second Corps at Mons. Another point I think worth making at this stage is that Sir John French does not cover himself in glory during the Battle of Mons. Actually, he liaises with both of his corps commanders on the morning of the 23rd of August, and then promptly clears off into the rear, and actually, in effect, makes no attempt to coordinate the action of his two corps that day. There was, in fact, no higher command at Mons on the British side, in the sense that there was no one individual able to stand back and take an overall view of the situation, to allocate reserves and resources, to assert his authority and issue order to both corps. What we had instead was the two corps commanders had to really sort things out among themselves. And actually having two commanders of equal status, without someone over the top to sort of act as a referee between them, is a very poor command situation to be in. It must be said, actually, neither of the corps commanders seemed to made very much effort, indeed if any effort at all, to keep Sir John French in the loop about what was going on. What happens, of course, at the end of the 23rd of August is that with the battle starting to fizzle out, the two commanders, in effect, have to act independently and both take decisions which end up taking them in different directions. Johnny Gough, Haig's chief of staff, brother, of course, of Hubert Gough, at 2 a.m. in the morning on the 21st of August, sends a telegram to Haig. Gough is actually at GHQ. It says, retreat at once on Bavay, where a defensive position will be taken up. First Corps to cover the retirement of Second Corps. And Haig then wrote in his diary, this seemed impossible. I was much further to the east, and I had to make a flank march in the face of the enemy. Now these orders, which is a belated attempt, of course, by French actually to assert control over his two corps without really having much of a grasp of the situation on the ground, aroused Haig's worst fears of encirclement. There are only 2 hours of darkness left, we're in August after all, and Haig feared an attack at dawn while strung out on the line of march. Now this goes completely against the concept of the fighting retreat, which Haig and indeed others had been thinking about experimenting with before the war. So instead, Haig, in the best traditions of the man on the spot, ignores these orders, forms a rearguard, and marches the rest of First Corps south. He uses field service regulations, in other words, in precisely the fashion for which they were intended, to provide, if the man on the spot knows more about the situation than does the high commander, the man on the spot is perfectly within his rights actually to disregard all orders which are actually not applicable. And Haig's approach is single-mindedly aiming to save the First Corps from what he regards as a fatally flawed plan, in the process, frankly, leaving Second Corps to cope the best that they can. French acquiesced in this, accepting the man on the spot doctrine. He later even paid tribute to Haig's excellent stand to recover the retirement of Second Corps, which suggests a rationalisation of the fact his orders were being disregarded, as well as part of his desire to denigrate Smith-Dorrien, which of course he had a long-term feud with. Well, Haig succeeds in taking First Corps south, and actually he regards the ease of First Corps' retreat as being somewhat suspicious. He thinks it might simply mean that the Germans are trying to encircle them further to the west. Of course, what actually happens after this is that the two corps have to go either side of the forest of Mons, which actually physically imposes a barrier between the two corps. So Haig becomes even more of an independent commander, something which I should point out, a role for which corps commanders had not been envisaged before the war. According to one strict reading of pre-war British doctrine, corps was supposed to be a sort of postbox through which orders from GHQ were distributed to divisions. So Haig and Smith-Dorrien found themselves acting as independent commanders in a way which really had not been envisaged, at least in doctrine, before the war. One of the most controversial parts of Haig's 1914 campaign comes up next. Haig reaches Landrecies, a small town at the southern tip of the forest of Mons, and that night, on the night rather of the 25th, 26th of August, Germans put in an attack, quite a small-scale attack on the town. The British are taken by surprise, and according to John Charters, who's on Haig's staff, later of course becomes a very controversial intelligence chief at GHQ, he claims that Haig basically panics. He is suffering quite badly from diarrhea at this stage. He comes out of his house, brandishing his service revolver, saying, "By God, so if we're caught by God, we'll sell our lives dearly." Now, this has become part of the great mythology of Haig, that actually, you know, at this one point during the war, he certainly lost his cool. Well, Mickey Ryan's letters and diaries, which have recently been published, actually give an interesting insight onto this. Because Ryan, who knew Haig very well and was quite close to him during this campaign, he was the one who administered the dose of jollop, which actually turned his constipation into the opposite. Says nothing about Haig losing his cool. Instead, he remarks that during the night of 26th August, Haig was very observant, saw things that others missed, and always gave his orders in such a quiet and intelligent manner as if he had a thorough grasp of the situation in even the most trying circumstances. Indeed, on the following day, on the 27th, in a letter home, he refers to Haig as splendid, merry, and bright. And interestingly, that Spencer chose Kipling's "If" as the poem to sum up the army of 1914, because Ryan actually compares Haig to. Well, the quote is that Haig was very striking, very calm, and like Kipling's "If." This gives a very, very different view of Haig during Landrecies. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, I suspect that Charters probably was exaggerating a bit. Possibly Ryan was underplaying it a bit. But I think we need to put at least a decent-sized question mark against the idea that Haig panicked and completely lost it that night at Landrecies. Well, okay. Haig firmly believed that during the stage that GHQ, that French had basically given up one corps for lost, he received only the most vague of instructions, and he really thought it was up to him to get one corps out of harm's way. Once you've marched beyond the threat of the German advance, you can then form up, turn round, and then to go on to counter-offensive. He's talking about sort of linking up with the French to do this. This, again, I think helps to explain why Haig does not give any support to, in fact, doesn't even attempt to give any support to Smith-Dorrien at Le Cateau on the 26th of August. To put the best spin on it from Haig's point of view, the two corps are physically separated by the Forest of Montmartre, and in a classic example of the fog of war, Haig was forced to make a decision based on fragmentary and incorrect information derived from rudimentary communications. Now, if Haig had actually followed GHQ's original orders, it certainly would have brought First Corps squarely into the battle. But the subsequent orders that were issued would have brought one corps beyond the immediate support of Smith-Dorrien. Haig would then have had the dilemma of whether to order his formations to retrace their steps and head north towards the battlefield, all the time once again fearing that First Corps were advancing into a trap which would result in its encirclement and destruction. And so effectively, he just abandons Smith-Dorrien and gets on with it. He actually sends two messages very late in the day at 8:30 and 11 p.m. that night via GHQ, because the Corps don't actually have any lateral electronic communications. The one at 8:30 read, "No news of Second Corps except sound of guns from the direction of Le Cateau. Can one corps be of any assistance?" Well, you might think he might have marched towards the sound of the guns, but for the reasons I've just given you, he chose not to do it. The 11 p.m. telegram, which actually is sent to Smith-Dorrien via GHQ, says this: we could hear the sound of your battle, could get no information as to its progress, could form no idea of how we could assist you. This lends itself, I think, to the interpretation that Haig was retrospectively and rather unconvincingly justifying his justifies refusal to even to countenance the possibility of marching towards the sound of the guns. John Terraine, Haig's doughtiest defender, suggested that Haig's often stated conviction that Smith-Dorrien was wrong to fight at Le Cateau suggests the First Corps commander was conscious of having fallen below his own high standards. Actually, I think that till the end of his days, Haig, rightly or wrongly, almost certainly wrongly, believed that Smith-Dorrien had been wrong to risk the destruction of Second Corps by giving battle at Le Cateau. And so, I think Haig does not emerge from this with any particular degree of credit, but I think, so at least to my own mind, looking into the context of Haig's belief and understanding about what the Germans are trying to do helps to explain why he took this decision, even if it doesn't actually make that decision right, make it correct. Spencer's already mentioned Nicholas Gardner's idea that Smith-Dorrien was not supported by Haig at Le Cateau out of personal jealousy, which I think this is just, it does not ring true for me. Haig was all too well aware of the huge weight of responsibility on his shoulders. His decisions taken in 1914 are perfectly explicable without recourse to conspiracy theories. They're taken by a 54-year-old man under stress, lacking sleep, groping around in the fog of war, quite ill at this time, a man, excuse me, above all, who was aware that if he was to make a mistake, it would have catastrophic consequences. And also, interestingly, in light of the comments that Spence was making about the importance of leadership, Haig made a real effort to get out and be seen by his men on the march. His reputation as a chateau general, certainly is not true of the 1914 retreat. 29th of August, for example, Mickey Ryan noted that he had rode for 45 miles with Haig all around his army, being seen by the troops on the ground. He was not loved in the same way as Sir John French was, but actually I think he was admired by the old condemptibles who came across him. Okay, well, Haig's command of First Corps in the Allied offensive, which began on the 6th of September, beginning of the Battle of Mons, is also quite controversial. It's been claimed that he was too cautious in the initial advance to the Marne and that his timidity played a role in the Allies' failure on the Aisne in September. But it's certainly true that on the 6th of September, the first day of the Battle of the Marne, Haig displayed considerable wariness in the advance. And again, he is extremely aware of what the Germans are like, how strong they are, and what they might end up doing. So what we see is a pattern of Haig relying quite heavily actually on aerial reconnaissance. And at one stage, actually, aircraft report the presence of large numbers of German troops, and it turns out to be a false report. So Haig, not unreasonably, slows his advance when he hears this. But we certainly do get indications that he's very well aware of the importance of driving on when you possibly can. So on the 9th of September, he found 5th Cavalry Brigade, quoting from Haig's diary, moving at a walk and delaying the advance of our infantry, and excuse me, he urged the brigade commander forward, for a little effort now might mean the conclusion of the war. It's actually quite a significant passage, because Haig, as a cavalryman, knew full well that cavalry needed to walk their horses as well as riding them to pace them, to spare them. For him to say, actually, no, don't walk horses, get on them and ride, shows actually the importance that Haig attached to a rapid advance at this stage. His first corps closes up to the river at Aisne on the 12th of September, and Haig chose to ignore GHQ orders to seize the crossings of the river and attack straight away, largely because by the time his troops are getting there, it's starting to get dark. And again, he's worried about what might happen. We now know, actually, that this was a mistake, that by halting for a night, this gave the Germans time to bring up their reinforcements, to actually get them onto the heights above the River Aisne, and actually this effectively meant that the BEF was not going to be able to break through this position. Of course, that was not to be known at the time, but Haig's decision probably condemned the BEF to trench warfare along this line. Having said that, I think even if the BEF had actually captured the heights by the Aisne and pushed a bit further on, we would only had the front being stalemated a few miles further on. What happens thereafter is a sort of very disconnected encounter battle, which Spencer's already talked about, and which Haig actually Haig's forces do reasonably well, but clearly the possibility of a straightforward breakthrough is vanishing. I think, judging the Aisne overall, and this is an area, not just Haig, but the entire British commitment to the Battle of the Aisne, is one that still needs some really, really serious research, is that assessment of Haig's generalship, he had not only made mistakes, and I think halting on the 12th probably was a mistake, but overall I think his generalship during this period was prudent and sound. Well, of course, following this, in mid-October, the BEF is shifted north to Flanders, and the BEF and Haig's one corps is plunged into confused semi-open warfare. Now moving on to eventually the first battle of Ypres. The two sort of critical dates, of course, are the 31st of October and the 11th of November. Both of these actions, in which the Germans come very, very close to breaking through, only for the day to be saved by battalion-level actions, says, I think, an awful lot about the limitations of what a corps commander, what Haig could actually do under these circumstances. On neither occasion was Haig actually directly responsible in issuing the orders which saved the day. All he could do was remain in the background, feed such reserves that remained within his hands to the front line to putty up, to use the phrase that was used at the time, to try and plug gaps in the line, and occasionally to try and exploit success. But really, this was, to use the cliche, a soldier's battle, and Haig's role in it actually was fairly minimal. Having said that, there is a big controversy about what he did on the 31st of October. According to Little Hart, and we heard from Pete earlier about some of his working methods, that he was told by Edmonds, the official historian after the war, that Haig had panicked on the 31st of October. He had issued First Corps orders to carry out a general retreat, but this had been hushed up. Well, the work of a number of historians, most principally, I guess, John Hussey, has shown conclusively there is actually no evidence to substantiate this claim. What Haig actually did was perfectly, properly carry out some preliminary thought, some preliminary thinking about what would actually happen in the event of things going disastrously wrong. Wrapped up in this is the famous occasion on which Haig rode towards the front line on the 31st of October. Now, this has been depicted by various writers in different ways. Was it Haig, reverting back to the sort of standard regimental soldiers when he was getting as close to the front as possible? Was Haig perhaps even trying to seek death in the front line with his soldiers? One historian has actually suggested that Haig was probably not very wise to leave his headquarters at this critical time, because of course under the First World War circumstances, the closer a commander got to the first line, frankly, the fewer men he could command. And by pushing right up into the front line, so the argument goes, Haig effectively reduced himself from a corps commander to a platoon commander. That's the only people who could actually issue orders to were those who could hear him shout. And it's been argued that actually, in fact, Ian Beckett has made the argument that anxiety certainly clouded Haig's judgment. I'm not sure about this at all. In his diary, Haig wrote this: "I got on my horse and rode forward to see if I could do anything to organise stragglers and push them forward to check the enemy." Now, certainly this is, I suspect, the instinct of an old regimental officer to go forward and lead. But there was more to it than that. Brigadier General Rice, his chief engineer, referred to Haig and his staff going forward where we established a sort of advanced headquarters. Now, this makes perfect sense. Haig went forward to assess the situation for himself, to speak to the commanders on the spot, to provide leadership to the troops on the ground. But as a result of these consultations, Haig ordered some redeployment of troops, in part to create a reserve and gain a clear picture of the state of his forces. So Haig was in a pretty unenviable position on the 31st of October. He was a commander who couldn't actually do very much to affect the battle on the front line. He spent the day doing what he could, organising reserves, sometimes by pulling men out of the firing line to meet possible eventualities, keeping subordinate commanders in touch with the situation on the other part of the Ypres front, impressing on Sir John French the gravity of the position, and preparing to pull back to a new defensive line should it prove to be impossible to dislodge the Germans from their gains. But on this day, and indeed also on the 11th of November, the next big crisis, Haig had no direct input into the decision to counterattack on either days. Okay, well, let's just have some concluding thoughts on this. Well, generally speaking, historians haven't paid very much attention to what Haig was doing in 1914. One exception to that is Paul Harris in his recent biography of Haig, which came out in 2008. And I think overall his biography presents a pretty negative portrait of Haig, and he's particularly critical of Haig's conduct of operations in the 1914 mobile phase. According to Harris, Haig went anxiously to war, possibly doubting his fitness to command. And his response, Haig's response at Mons to Smith-Dorrien's request for support, appears niggardly, perhaps as disgracefully so. Paul Harris doesn't think an awful lot of Haig in this period, I think it's fair to say. Well, he's not entirely wrong. Haig clearly does make some mistakes, and I hope I've made that clear today. But to my mind, the documentary record simply does not support the idea that on the outbreak of war, Haig doubted his ability to command. He had no illusions about the scale of the task in hand. As his official biographer said in somewhat extravagant language, it was the moment for which he had been preparing, but to which he had not looked forward with any emotion save those of awe and dread. This strikes me as a reaction of a thorough professional who understood through the study of military history and German doctrine the sheer challenge posed by the enemy army to the BEF and more widely the Allied cause. The realities of coalition warfare, I think, rendered Haig's plan, which he put forward at the War Council held at Downing Street on the 5th of August, redundant. Haig had actually argued for the BEF to be held back for 3 months in the UK to build up a mass army on the cadre and mobilising the resources of the empire. Which actually this is in line with his strategic vision, which actually he had been expressing for at least 7 or 8 years by this point. Also, I think Haig's sombre mood in 1914 was informed by his well-founded doubts about the competence of Sir John French to command the BEF, and for that matter, the competence of Archie Murray, his chief of staff. I don't actually detect in that any real worries about Douglas Haig's own ability to cope with the scale of command. Well, what did Haig learn from the campaign of 1914? Well, first thing, and this actually is important, it reinforced his healthy respect for the German army and also for the skill and resilience of his own men. But several other things stand out as well. The first is that his combat experience, I think, led him to believe that pre-war doctrine and principles were sound, but simply needed to be adapted to the new circumstances. And he stuck to this view right through the war. In fact, on the 11th of November 1918, he says something in the diary to that effect, that sticking to FSR actually has brought us through this war. The second thing, I think he was very keenly aware how narrow the margin between survival and defeat had been, particularly at First Ypres. Had the Germans pressed their attacks on the 31st of October and the 11th of November, the BEF probably would have been defeated. This fed into his belief, encapsulated in FSR, that, quote, decisive success in battle can be gained only by a vigorous offensive. In fact, during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, Passchendaele, he cited the German failure of the 31st of October 1914 to push on as a warning to his army commanders not to fall into the same trap. Some historians will see this as being a bad thing. Haig was actually sort of relying on the experience of 1914, and that influenced the way he conducted operations at Passchendaele. I have a rather more open mind about it. The third, I think, was a reinforcement of his view that Sir John French was unfit for high command. And this opinion was, of course, to be of some consequence during 1915. But at the end of 1914, of course, the Somme and Passchendaele and Amiens are all in the future. At that time, at the end of 1914, Douglas Haig had clearly emerged from the fighting with an immensely enhanced reputation. He was now a clear rival to Smith-Dorrien as French's heir apparent. Likewise, the importance of Haig's generalship, especially at Ypres, was widely recognised throughout the army. Haig was fortunate in his subordinate commanders and in the regimental officers, NCOs and ordinary soldiers of one corps, as Haig fully recognised. In the eyes of some contemporaries, Haig's performance actually at the defensive battle at Ypres eclipsed his role on the offensive on the Aisne. As late as the 5th of July 1916, a somewhat hostile witness, Henry Wilson, described Haig as a good, stout-hearted defensive soldier, going on to imply that success in defence required little but tenacity. Haig had no imagination and very little brains and very little sympathy. Well, not sure about the last bit, and that remark must, of course, be placed in the context of the recent attack on the Somme. But at the end of 1914, Haig clearly had proved his mettle in defence at the First Battle of Ypres and also in the attack on the Aisne. Thank you very much.
It's a long way to Paris, it's a long way to go, it's a long way les soldats